long axis, the long side is where the lecture is. And the students all sit along tables, which I think probably promotes group work, and that's good. But the kids, and there are three big screens, and the kids over there can't see
the other one over there.
I mean, it's really, and when I got to see this, it's always try, always, because
You can do that, and they have it.
no, in med school, the old med school on campus, it was wonderful. And you could,
Yeah, it was nice, slow gathering and
conversations, lectures are interactive. It allows you to take the direction students want to go.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
You're pretty much obliged to
you're
do
locked in.
what it is. And I don't think I've ever given a slideshow lecture to students.
Bob, do you want to stay back there? Or do you want to come up here? Whatever's best for you.
Inspiring.
Well, there's an extra seat right there.
Most,
Right
most
Name is like.
Whatever.
I'm in the right spot. You were so.
Except that you won't be able to see the whiteboard.
This is academia. Nobody's going to.
We just threw back one. And then,
it was my job in the mornings to put the faculty together.
No, okay, he needs to be.
I remember hearing one lecture on immunology of tuberculosis.
Why don't you go front and center there?
No, Dr. Hall,
That's right. The next lecture was on malaria, and it was content free. But the lecture was trying.
Get up.
Everybody thought that. And when
You
you
know, write those ideas.
I realized he's evaluation fast.
Oh.
Test 1 2. Testing. Test 1 2.
Sure.
Test 1 2. Testing.
Thank you, Rob. We'll get those screens up, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm just whining.
Now you take it that way.
I think you're barely whining.
Kathy?
Barely.
You don't hold sit over here for.
I know, but you know, he's a word. Has he shown you? But he's a kind of a word game, wordplay. That's his thing. Wordplay. Are we on? Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our morning session of our conference on restoring professionalism to the practice of medicine. How can the law be helpful? And what I'd like to do is begin with just listing the ideas that we had yesterday, and then asking if anyone has additional suggestions, and then going through the ideas and thinking about which are the ones that we think are the most promising, and then think about how we can effectuate them. Okay, how does that sound? Okay, so according to my list, the first thing we have is Bob's suggestion of a billing code for patient advocacy. We have Sarah's suggestion for malpractice protection for physicians, or continuing, in this case, continuing micros protections. We have Mark Hall's suggestion of restricting private equity ownership of physician practices. We have Stuart's suggestion of fostering unionization and collective bargaining. We have Mylan's suggestion of thinking of ways in which the fiduciary requirements or expectations, fiduciary expectations for attorneys can be exported and employed in the context of practice of medicine. We have my suggestions of getting states and courts to adopt more uniformly protections for physicians when they advocate for their patients and particularly extending a type of whistleblower protection, the most comprehensive legal protection against retaliation. We have also Bob's suggestion of enhancing the role of state medical boards. To play a greater role in physician advocacy and also medical necessity judgments. And we have the suggestion of the medical students to relax or adjust or eliminate medical school tuition. Have I missed anything? Not on the list? Anybody we've raised? If not, so apologizing for my penmanship. Any of these ideas that we don't think are particularly worth pursuing? I want to start on a negative note necessarily, but are all of these good ideas? I mean, there was a lot of pushback, I think, to the tuition idea, right? I mean, JB in particular, I think, had some questions about the wisdom of pursuing that. But any thoughts, any comments?
Yeah, I just reiterate what I said yesterday. I think that we need to look at making state-sponsored school less expensive and more available. I mean, it's really providing more spots. I mean, again, supply and demand, excess demand.
So public medical schools, right? And your thought is to do what about them?
Expand the opportunities, more students in each school. Sorry.
So that would be expanding the number of students in each school. There have been a number of new medical schools in California, but those have been public and associated with, very high price.
Those
Private.
And do we? I mean, is there a problem with having enough residency slots for an increased number of medical students?
That's a massive problem. There's a large percent, I think 10 to 15 to 20% of students do not match now, because they've expanded medical schools, but not residency opportunities.
Really?
Yes.
And can is anybody familiar with how the allocation of residency slots is done? Does anybody, can you tell us about, how that, I mean, my understanding is that there are controls that limit it, and I think, are they federal government controls in part due to how they're paid? I mean, Dr. Letterman, can you enlighten us, or Dr. Frizzo?
I'm not sure I can get down to the nitty gritty of it, but each institution determines how many slots they want, and then they look to see what resources they get. They get some funds from the federales to support the work that they do. But if you want to have 15 residents or 20 residents, it's pretty much your call, so long as you can come up with the money for it. I don't think they can restrict your number of resident spots.
I thought, okay, pardon that?
Right, but if you can find the funds from somewhere else and
do
you pay
they,
these
I mean,
guys.
is it common? Is it that medicals that hospitals will have more slots than they're being paid for from Medicare and other public sources?
It used to be the case that that hospitals would not fill their slots, and the most competitive programs would fill up with the most attractive applicants. It's always done on the basis of this computer match, but the less attractive programs in less attractive places would often not fill, and they would compete to fill their positions with graduates who either themselves did not match, and they still do that because they announce that you matched several days before you know where you match, and so that you can look around, scrounge for another position. But programs used to fill their slots with trainees, graduates from foreign medical programs, in order to meet their patient care and other expectations.
Do you have? Were you going to say something? No, please.
Well, a lot of talk yesterday was about relationships, legal and medical.
Are you moving to another topic, or?
Well, I was going to add something that can make a difference.
Okay, well, go ahead, because I want to come back to the medical school tuition residency question, but go ahead.
This is a little bit self-serving as a retired family physician, primary care person, but I actually think that reinvigorating primary care because of its long-term relationships is in fact a relevant solution, partial solution to this.
Any thoughts on how to do that? Pay? What do you mean pay? Pay. They are paid. What do you mean pay? Pay them more?
No, the disparity between specialists who use high technology and primary care people is, that ties in with the medical debt because, students say, what I can, if I'm a dermatologist, I hope I'm not insulting anybody in the room. If I'm a dermatologist, I can make a lot of money doing procedures with very low risk. And if you're in primary care, it's a different ballgame.
So I know that and you probably know more about this than I do, when CMS instituted the resource-based relative value scale system, what was that, in the mid-90s? I can't remember. But
93.
There was an adjustment because of, and that changed how physicians were reimbursed under Medicare. And it resulted in a reduction in some specialty reimbursement, an increase in some primary care, and I think psychiatry, maybe pediatrics. I don't remember. I had a slide that I show in class, which I don't have with me. But since then, I mean, it doesn't seem that the reimbursement for primary care, pediatrics, that realm, which, as you say, is so important for all kinds of reasons, has been adequate or has increased sufficiently to attract students into that, medical graduates into that.
It slid backwards because of this thing called the RUC, which makes the annual adjustments, which is primarily populated by specialists. So the RBRVS as a leftist, I was really struck, was basically Marx's labor theory of value. And when it disappeared, when it got attenuated, to be polite about it, it was the theory of power. I'm putting this down.
JB?
Yeah, just kind of, you took it away. I always thought the RUC is pronounced the ruck. It's got this guttural sound, it sort of seems appropriate for that. To put a pin in it, rebasing the RBRVS, the Medicare fee schedule, would be an obvious thing to do, because what's happened over time, at the beginning, when that was set up, you can argue whether the 4 dimensions of how they came up with those weights were right or not, but they were pretty good, and they got 92% inter-rater reliability among what, 90,000 physicians or some huge number.
It's hard to hear you. Just speak a little
closer to the mic.
Yeah, speak a little louder.
It's a conspiracy. It's a Russian. It's a Russians, yeah. So at the beginning of the 93, I think you could argue the numbers and the compensations were reasonable relative, and pretty much physicians agreed. But since then, we haven't gone back and rebased it, and we've used a committee structure that you mentioned to update it, and it has to be zero-based. So as you get more gizmos to stick in various orifices and charge higher rates for that, then everybody else has to go down, including the evaluation management code. So, which is primary care. So the evaluation management codes have been flat, if anything, while the specialist codes have been going up. And if you talk to American College of Physicians or other family practice doc, they're not happy about this at all, for a very good reason, because their incomes have been flat or going down. So rebasing it would be the obvious thing to do, but it's internal politics and medicine. That's the problem.
We'll come back to that, but why have the reimbursement levels for primary care, that cluster of practice areas, remain flat while the specialty reimbursement has increased? Because
the RUC has decided,
and stuff like that.
well, the RUC has decided this is a higher level of complexity, so they raise the rate for endoscopes or something like that, and that means that it's got to take it away from someplace else. So you just go back and take 2% away from everybody else. So there are two parts of it. Oh, now I'm God. There are two parts of it. One is the conversion rate to take those weights and turn them into real dollars has not been going up. And it was started at a very low number to begin with, thanks to their concern about upcoding and such. So it started from a low base and that didn't help. But then it hasn't been upgraded over the period of time. So the obvious thing is go back and redo it again. You know, if you read it again, what you find, and there have been some ad hoc changes in the last few years. Maybe you're up to more than I have, but some of the specialty things have been arbitrarily cut, partly because of all this pressure, but it hasn't been enough to make a difference in the primary care codes, E&M codes. So I think it's a pretty technical thing, but it's pretty clearly shows up in total compensation.
And just one question, the RUC, the RUC you're referring to,
That's
is.
that committee of specialists, primarily specialists.
Well,
What is that? What do the initials stand for? Okay, this is not a test. Don't worry about it.
no, we'll look at
And
it.
that is an entity where? Is that a government entity? Is that part of
Specialties,
CMS?
I think it's convened by the government, but the specialty societies all have a vote.
Everybody has a vote. Industry does, insurance, pharmaceuticals. There's a bunch of people that
So
are on it.
if you have,
RVS update committee.
so primary care has one vote and then you have 50 specialists and specialties and
It's
they
not
each
quite
have
that.
one.
No, it's not. No,
It's not quite
yeah.
that.
No, everybody fights to get their specialty spot, but there's only so many spots on the committee.
And how is that governance structure, who creates that governor and maintains that
It's either
governance?
in law or regulation, I'm not sure, but the feds have condoned this because it's federal payment. So it's an advisory body for the feds.
The AMA runs it.
The
AMA is the convener, I believe.
Yes, correct.
Okay, and I don't know much about the internal politics of the AMA, but.
Well,
Go
the-
ahead.
Yeah, they make recommendations, but Medicare makes the decision.
Right.
You know, they're the ultimate deciders, and a lot of specialties have taken big cuts over a period of time, and it's probably time to redo everything. Yes, but anything with high volume immediately is cut. So if you're doing a lot of cardiac caths get cut every year. There's more and more because people are getting older, and you need to do cardiac caths. Same with cataract surgery. So, they're looking at big budgets and they just cut them. When I started cataract surgery in 1996, it was being paid approximately $700 or $800. We're down to $500 now.
You were wildly overpaid back then.
No, they were wildly paid in the 80s. They were paid $2,000 for cataracts.
And so
But it was different technology. It was
Correct.
a lot easier now.
Correct. It is. It is.
So what is the rationale behind if more people are aging and their sight is failing and we need to do more cataract
Right.
surgery, we're going to reduce the reimbursement? Is the idea that cataract surgeons will make the same amount of money because they'll be doing,
Yeah, make it up on volume. That's the old joke in medicine. Just make it up on
well,
volume.
at least on a fee for
But
service.
colonoscopies, all of these things, as we get older, things just need to be done, and the budgets are limited, and so that they have to make budgetary decisions.
I mean, so the
It is a
positive-
zero-sum game in the sense that each year the total value goes up, but more and more is in excess of what is actually supplied in terms of
But the rationale is
finances.
supposed to be the amount of work that's involved. So cataract surgery originally was very complicated and dangerous and
Right.
everything. As it got to be more routine,
Right.
particularly with computers and such, it got to be less work,
Right.
So, but instead of going back and actually doing the original work again to test that, the committee just says, well, it looks like it's 10% less work than it was last year. Or
Yes,
20%.
they just, they
Just
do
like-
numbers.
So there's no basis for it.
I
It's
mean,
just a wild guess.
they go out and I can tell you as a specialist, the RUC and then the specialty societies go out to the specialists and find out and do surveys and find out and figure out how much things cost. Because there's not only the work, there's malpractice value, there's other things that go into the calculation. I don't know all the calculations, but they ask it. And every once in a while, I get one of these surveys, I fill it out and we send it in. And, some of the specialties obviously are self-serving. I mean, this is how it goes, right? But I just want to point out that last year, 2,200 people did not match in a residency last year. 2,200. And
that means what is a practical
Is that
matter?
American and foreign? or-
that's American students, American medical schools.
So what happens to those students if they can't get a residency?
You kick around and you go do research somewhere and you apply again next year. Now, some of the states, I know in Arizona and California, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, they have passed state laws where you can go work for a family practitioner, work for them for 3 years in an unregulated environment, and then be declared a family practitioner after 3 years. Yes,
Which states are these?
I believe it's Arizona and California. I'll look those up
Without
again.
doing a first.
Without
at least
a
one-year
official-
residency, which is normally what's at least the minimum required for licensure.
Correct. You at least need to do an internship.
Once they sit for boards?
No, I think they're declared family practitioners. This is out of necessity.
Well, okay, so reinvigorating primary care by, among other things, perhaps, altering the residency program, increasing residency slots, and most importantly, recalculating the reimbursement schedules to make it more attractive to be one of those types of practitioners, right? Is that the idea? Just one question. Yeah, Bob.
Are you taking a fresh idea?
Not yet. I had one thought before we go to that.
I just want to say one thing about the
Shrinkage of available slots for residents. It used to be that a hospital could extract a great deal of work from its residents by making us work every other night, and have really intense schedules. You can't do that anymore for a variety of reasons, some of which are valid, some of which are not. So the amount of labor that you can get from a resident nowadays is really restricted. So you can't really afford to have a large number of residents.
And you're referring to the limitations that have been placed on work hours,
Exactly.
shift length, things like that,
Exactly.
which my understanding is were instituted because of the risks, the quality issues that were perceived with.
No, they were instituted because of Libby Zion.
Of course, of what?
Because of Libby Zion, who was the daughter of a New York Times columnist who received a medication that was contraindicated when she arrived at an emergency room. And one of the arguments that was made was that the resident had been on call for many hours and was incautious. And it's hard to demonstrate that a substantial number of really important mistakes are driven by sleeplessness. Certainly you don't do as well on a test, but as to whether or not it badly affects primary care or actual care, there have been arguments the other way, that right now the handing over of patients and the care of patients by physicians, house staff physicians who know nothing about the patient is a bad outcome as well, because there's no team regularly providing care because of hour restrictions.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, Dr. Curtis was asked about at least were his statistics American medical graduates or also foreign medical graduates, so physicians, medical students. Is there anything to be said about the role of foreign medical school graduates in all of this? I mean, is that some kind of a special case that we should think about, or is that one of the solutions to the dearth of primary care access? I mean,
Well, for several years now there's only one way to become licensed now in the United States, and that's to pass the USMLE. And for many folks, that's a language barrier. It's also maybe an educational barrier, depending on the quality of the medical schools. I know that in California, there's a list of approved medical schools. In other words, if you graduate from another one, it's a longer process if you're not on the list.
and the list is of foreign medical schools,
Correct,
right? Because the
correct.
American schools would be credited or not.
Exactly. And so then, you have to pass that USMLE, and that typically is the deal breaker for a lot of folks.
Okay. Dr. Batanti.
Professor, yesterday I was intrigued by the panel that you were able to put together of medical students, and you had some PhD students, law students as well. But I thought, Jesus, they came in at the end or in the middle of a presentation, and then they exited when the whole program is about them. So I thought, this illustrates we're talking about health law and doctors and healthcare. And at some point, we have to recognize that physicians in the medical practice is so highly regulated by law that at some point, there needs to be a mandatory amount of time in medical schools to teach health law. It's, we're way past that time, but, it just hasn't been raised adequately.
Health law is one thing, but also the importance of fidelity. Not just the legal implications or legal structure to reinforce that, but and I don't know if I mentioned it yesterday publicly, but I asked the medical students in my class how much they are being exposed to both the history that we went through yesterday, but also the modern implications of this duty of fidelity. And they said virtually nothing. They have bioethics training, but apparently it does not spend a great deal of time on this in this realm. And but the problem, of course, is if you increase the teaching of that, what do you eliminate? What technical skills do they not get trained as much in? So not to cast aspersions, but I have never lectured or spoken or taught the medical students at our medical school about any of this. I've never been asked to. For years, I spent several days teaching it to the osteopathic medical students in Ohio, but not to our medical students at the medical school. And I have no idea why that was the case. I don't think it was personal, but I think it was just a question of what's important in the curriculum. Dr. Batanti.
I was permitted 1 year, 2 years actually, to put a medical legal program together specifically for physicians in my specialty during their residency training. It was extremely well received by the residents, but the other faculty did not appreciate it, except the chair. The chair appreciated it, but they felt that it was taken away from their training. And the counter argument to that is, how many times do you need to go over the same clinical feature before you own it? You own it, how many times again? And the things we talked about were medical legal things that we spoke about in this very project here. They don't even know they have an obligation to advocate. They don't even know that. They don't know that they have anti-retaliation statutes to protect them. I mean, how are they going to get it if nobody teaches it to them? What good are the laws that we're talking about doing if it never gets to them?
But so much of this is viewed as a kind of a zero-sum game, or as we were talking before about residencies, there's so much, or reimbursement rather, there's a pie, and it's not a question, it's difficult to make the pie bigger. It boils down to a question of, slicing it differently. And, part of, I think one of the problems may be the difficulty of demonstrating value in what we're trying to promote. Right. I mean, so for example, Libby Zion, if you can capture the public attention about the need for something, then the best way to do that is a stark illustration like that incident, but also data that show that if doctors were able to do this, these are the good things that would happen. And so far as I know, there's none of that. I mean, very little that I'm aware of. I would be happy. I'd be delighted to be corrected. But all right, well, we can come back to that.
I think the reason is that it's natural for every faculty to want to have to recreate themselves. So I want to teach you what I know, to recreate themselves.
I'm sorry.
All the faculty members want to have little sets, little clones coming around. And so, clearly I can teach a lot more about really important stuff. And so you got to give up time to do that. It just isn't going to work that way. I was thinking about while you're talking though, that the lever, I think on this one is accreditation. Accreditation, that if you can get practicing physicians who know that this is important. I don't know what the input is into the accreditation standards, but if they can have if they can get anything into that. And so one is just getting it on the table. The second is competency based, because some of the, my impression is, at least I think some of the boards now, and maybe some of the other accreditation things, at least I know this is true in business schools, you're supposed to show competency of the students around certain things. It doesn't say they have to have a course. It has to say they have to learn something about it and be competent in some way. So if you wanted a lever, that's where I go for this one.
So you have been on the board of the Joint Commission, correct? It seems to me that is a very important tool in achieving many of, not tools, I don't mean disparity, route to achieving some of these changes that we're talking about, is to have standards created for accreditation, for example, for hospitals and other healthcare organizations that would require some of these things, assuming that they could be designed in ways that were not oppressive to the institutions that were being.
There are two levers on that one. One is the conditions of participation in Medicare, the COP. The second is accreditation. That again is tied back to cutting back to payment. The accreditation would be, you'd have to follow the logic through from quality, because that's the reason for it, and show that in fact by not having some of the things we're talking about, that the patients would suffer in terms of quality. So it's partly a database research question, logical thing to make that point. The concern is that you'd have, I think organized medicine would push back. I remember one or two times where the AMA was pushing really hard, very conservative way to eliminate things that might have been good, but didn't particularly, from their point of view, work from their economic benefit. So I think organized medicine is both a potential lever, but also an impediment on this one.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. Professor Van Tassel.
Thank you so much. Fred Hafferty says that there's, just building on this conversation, there's little incentive for hospitalized to radicalize residents with this type of education. And in building on what JB is saying, both accreditation and CBME, competency-based medical education, are good levers.
CBME stands for competency-based. Okay. And I don't know if Fred can participate more easily, but so his idea of using that as a lever to make some of these things happen, I'm not quite sure. I don't understand how that would work. I mean, so in other words, create a competency in advocacy, for example, that medical students would have to be.
You might have to demonstrate on the boards competency in certain kinds of areas that I haven't done this for years, but I sat down and looked at some of the approaches that I can't remember which specialty it was. It might have been American College of Physicians, but I thought they had some situation-based competency things in there around patient care, but it was largely medical treatment. Here's the data you got. Now what do you do next, kind of thing. If you did the same thing with here's the patient liability or whatever it may be, or here's a quality issue that we have an infection rate of MRSA or something like that. What do you do? I don't know. I'm making this up on the fly, but I think that might be the kind of thing you could do.
But then you raise the problem that we've identified, which is the cascade, backwards of if you're testing this as a competency, then you have to train them in what goes by, what you give up to add this to their training, package.
That's what they have to do. That's create pressure on the medical schools and the teaching hospitals to do it.
There's Fred. Yeah, Fred. Were you gonna add something?
I, excuse me, I wasn't, but I got prompted to, whoops, excuse me, I got to switch.
We can hear you fine.
Excuse me. My apologies. I have to use two different sets of earphones, one to listen with and one to talk with. All I was going to say is that the conversation you're having right now is really important. But as all, not but, and as always, the devil is in the details. So, how you're going to work through CBME, competency-based medical education, is critical because that's the language of the day. All UME and GME, undergraduate medical education and graduate medical education, is organized around this language. It's a language of competencies. And when administrators or faculty talk, they use this language. Now, there are 6 core competencies identified by the ACGME and the ABMS quite a while ago. And those have sort of spilled their way out into both the formal and informal curriculum, but the devil is in the details. And the same with accreditation. How you work this into the LCME for undergraduate medical education and the ACGME for graduate medical education on up through CPD is a huge issue, but it's an important one.
The devil is in the details, and also the devil is in getting things done. How do you, where are the levers of power that need to be moved? Who has to be convinced, and how do you do that? But we'll come back to that, I think. Dr. Frizoff, can we pass, JB, can you pass the microphone?
I want to get, this is not a direct comment on any of the things on the list, but I want to get back to the question of history. One of the most interesting things in my lifetime, which is, and I view as medical ethics, is the role of physicians taking either money or gifts of going to fancy conferences for free. That was prevalent for decades and has really ended in the last 2 decades. I mean, there's much, much less. I think that was a huge ethical problem for physicians in the way that you described, what ethics are. I don't know. I mean, I know some of the things that some people did to make a difference to make that happen, but I think that's actually a very interesting case study for how do we change medical ethics some more. And since I got the microphone, I'll make one other comment. I haven't thought about malpractice for decades. In the early days of advocating for universal health care, we all had positions on what to do about malpractice. The other striking historical thing is the huge percentage of physicians who are now salaried, versus what it was when I started practice and others started practice. It seems to me, from building on the discussion yesterday, that malpractice protection really needs to change to sentinel event systemic evaluation. In other words, that, when mistakes happen, given the semi-collegial way or that practice happens now, we need to rethink it in terms of the systems that are now more prevalent than they used to be. So I don't know enough about you're giving me a sort of funny look. I don't know enough about malpractice law to say anything, but I think that looking at systems and sentinel events is an important way of addressing malpractice.
Okay, I understand. So how did the, I call them with no disrespect, physician crunchy limits or medical student crunchy limits, because my recollection is that when you were, in medical school, you got all kinds of nice things computers, black bags, and invitations to food, things like that, and that has been scaled way back. And I know a lot of it came from actually pressure from organized medicine to do that. And the AMA, Council on Ethical Judicial Affairs, came out with with rulings or opinions that rejected those measures, and that was put into effect by medical schools and others. Yeah, I mean, so part of our challenge is how we're positive changes in the past brought about, and what can we learn from that if we want to bring about some of these positive changes in the future. Okay, any other thoughts on anything here? Any other? I mean, we're not going to leave this, by the way, but any other suggestions that we haven't thought about? Important things that we need to do. Dr. Letterman.
So these are all issues that can be addressed, but you can see how overwhelming it is. You can see how overwhelming these things are. And I think we need to recognize that what would simplify and betterize so many of these issues is a complete revamping of the way we provide medical care, which is beyond what you and I can do right now. But I the entire system is somewhat too complex and too corrupt. Is probably not the right word, but it's dysfunctional. And each of these things nibbles at the edges a little bit and might make it a little better. But I think we need to realize that what's really needed is we've got to make an omelet.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, but I'm daunted by just this, by just trying to do this. I think that's another fight. Maybe someday we'll get there. I know, Dr. Frizoff has been working very hard on transforming at least, major aspects of our medical system. But okay, point taken. Yes, Dr. Batanti.
Well, just a comment on one thing that I brought up yesterday. Instead of sticking to the idea of going into underprivileged neighborhoods, recruiting students there, hoping that they go back to those neighborhoods, I think has proven not to be effective. I think that to deliver care to underserved areas, we need the differential pay model to drive care there now and not wait, for some other kind of recruiting scheme to work. A differential pay to drive care where it's needed.
Deteriorates as I get farther down the board. Okay. Thoughts on that? Any comments on that? I mean, the problem of underserved populations is also, to some extent, a bigger piece of the puzzle that we're probably not going to be able to do too much about within the context of facilitating physician fidelity patients, but very, very important. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just reflecting on, I was looking at the title of this program, Restoring Medical Professionalism, Physicians Advocates for Their Patients. This whole list we've got here, excuse me, they hit all kinds of areas. So the question I have for each one of them is, what's the problem we're trying to address? This is a pretty specific problem, getting the right resources to the right places, because you can't do this until you get primary care in the community and things of that sort. But there are a variety of others, that unionization, pay issues, billing, that may be attracting a different thing. And how do we, what's this? Louder?
It's the people at home that may have.
Yes, I know, the people home. So the question is, if you want to take what we have on the board and make it effective, I think you start with what's the problem we're trying to address and how's this going to address it? And I see if we define it as just getting the right resources in the right place, so then the patients can, the physicians can be the advocate. That's one thing. If you want them to have the incentive to be the advocate, then maybe it's legal responsibility, it's codes of ethics, it's liability, it's, pay for performance. I mean, you can think of all kinds of possibilities here, as well as just teaching medical, teaching the right things in medical school. They understand that they've got a responsibility. I find boards of directors, for instance, of hospitals don't know that they have a responsibility for quality. Them, not, that ultimately it goes back. They don't get that. Nobody tells them that. But you darn well, and so the quality stuff just falls off the agenda if you're not careful. Nobody pays attention to it. We need to be able to get the organizations of society focused on these things and then think about what the levers are that get them to move the right direction. So I guess it's the organization of all this. And I am amazed that you got all this out of yesterday's discussion, because I wasn't gone that long that you came up with all this stuff.
Professor Hall.
All right, so picking up on that challenge and coming back to Dr. Vissov's points about system level issues in medical liability, I guess I do have to ask, I mean, without insulting perhaps one of our sponsors or whatever, just blanket malpractice protection just seems too coarse of a topic, and particularly with regard to the principal focus of the gathering. So I would first start by thinking more in terms of malpractice reform rather than just protection.
Well, maybe I put the wrong term.
But in that regard, I mean, there's sticks and there's carrots, and we have lots of carrots, and this is the one little stick. And for instance, maybe enhancing liability for managed care companies would be a positive. Addressing the risk of preemption that keeps managed care, like the Wickline type of case, from where you're balancing the influences of, or the Pegram type of case. So that's a liability increase rather than protection. Or in terms of protecting physicians, I guess my question would be, how direct is the connection with issues of loyalty and what have you? I mean, you could imagine a regime of sort of fiduciary liability that says a physician who isn't sufficiently attuned to the patient's interest and sufficiently an advocate and what have you could maybe be subject to some form of liability. So I think that needs to be much more nuanced before it remains on the board. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and that's a tension that I referred to a couple of times yesterday, and particularly in my own journey through this through this subject matter, and that is I started out with a sort of stick approach, and have moved to try to make it more of a carrot approach, but we can certainly, the sticks are still, certainly on the table, to mix all kinds of metaphors.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the malpractice, reform / protection. I mean, I think it's a fair question of what is the direct connection between that and the ability of, that can change certain things in perhaps in good directions. But how does that relate specifically to the ability of physicians, or the willingness of physicians to be advocates for their patients? So Dr. Curtis.
Well, as a doctor in private practice, I can tell you all of these. When I saw the title, I also saw a title, "Can Law Save Medicine?" I mean, that was part of what I see. And yeah, well, yes, sure. But all of these things, certain aspects, certainly not everything all encompassing, but all of these things up here can really help medicine and help physicians. I'll just go on unionization. How's unionization going to save medicine? Well, for many of you don't know what doctors at Kaiser are forced to do. They're forced to see patients every 10 minutes, and you cannot see a patient and do a sufficient job for people. And they're putting people on telephones now, and they don't even want to come in the office. And doctors are going home and doing hours of EHR work after they're done. And this is, it's not fair to a doctor but it's not fair to the patients. And so unionization, I know it's not necessarily a legal function, but unionization is certainly a excellent way of evening it up and providing better care for patients. I can go right down the list. Billing code, sometimes doctors give up, there are limited times and they can't help the patient. So the billing code certainly will help doctors. Malpractice protection, I can tell you, when this goes through in California, if it does, and it goes through because there may be some negotiations that are occurring, doctors are going out of business. Doctors will just quit. And that's no good for patients. And that's saving medicine. I call that saving medicine. Restricting PD ownership. When non-physicians get involved in managing medical practices, it changes the tenor of what we're supposed to be doing for patients because it becomes a money issue. These guys are in it for money. They are not in it for any other reason. They're in it for money. And went over the unionization, law and fiduciary. We had a long discussion on that. Legal protections, medical boards. We know all of these. I could keep going, but all of these things are for practicing and for making patients better. That is what our profession is to do, is to make patient better and address their issues. The last one on the bottom, the tuition, I wanted to add, we probably should, the easiest thing to do is to change the programs which forgive loans. Forgiving loans over 10 years is not effective. But forgiving loans up front will put people in rural and urban areas. And that should be a concentration of the medical students. Asking for free tuition is a little bit loaded and probably not going to go anywhere. But for somebody who has made the commitment and is in $300,000 in debt, they may be willing to go if they can see some return quickly. If it's over 10 years, you might as well just go and do whatever you want. And continuing on what Bob said, once people get in medical school, most people are on a one-track mind to finish their training and be done. And I forgot to share with the medical students that I was fortunate, and the military told me I was going to go be a general doctor first. And I got to taste medicine. I got to taste what medicine had to offer, and I made a different decision. I was going to be an orthopedist, but now an ophthalmologist. And it's because I was exposed to looking at bad knees and neck and backs for 3 years. And I figured I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. So most of these students don't understand that. So loan forgiveness, maybe they go out and serve a couple of years after their medical school and they get a taste of what's going on, and then they apply to residencies.
It's called the National Health Service Corps. It was established in the early 70s.
Mike. Take the mic. I'm sorry.
And that was the National Health Service Corps, established in the early 70s, and did that. It was more than 1 year. It was about 3 or 4 years. Yeah.
Was that Vista or was that?
No, the National Health Service Corps.
And what happened to that?
It's sort of been attenuated. I think it still exists, but underfunded.
I'm sorry.
No, if we wanted to go over, we can go over each of these and go through, but I think we've kind of worked on this last one a little bit longer.
So what I'm hearing,
I want to make a big picture comment. So I don't know how many of you know the abbreviation INSTPA. Anybody know that? Maybe that's a family thing. I'll never see these people again. And unfortunately, medicine in a lot of ways has become a shift operation rather than a Fidelity long-term relationship operation. And is it the system that has the long-term relationship, or is it the individual physician? And I think that's some of the challenge that we really have to address. And that's primary care was built on comprehensive and continuing. And continuing has also seriously been attenuated within the health system. So
yeah, I'm surprised that we haven't mentioned, and you may be I think part of what you're saying is alluding to the medical staffs and their role in all of this. I think it's fair to say the extent to which their power and role has been diminished as hospital systems have become more and more administrative focused and on the other side of that triangle. And I'm particularly, I mean, personally, I mean, the idea that your primary care physician is no longer, able to control, to be involved with you once you're admitted to the hospital and your care is shifted to hospitalists. That is so appalling to me. I mean, I can't understand the rationale for that.
Well, I do work in managed care, and I can tell you why it's happened. When a doctor, a family practitioner has a whole day, 30 patients, 25 patients, whatever, they would typically go at the end of the day to see their patients in the hospital. And that really led to inefficient care. And most of the money is spent in the hospital, and it's spent in hospital days. And you cannot discharge patients effectively unless you have somebody attending to the hospitalized patients on a continuing basis all day. And this has been well shown, I know in your hospital system, you see it, the hospital days go through the roof and the money goes out the door. And with limited resources, it's one of those decisions that was made based on business maybe, but I think sometimes the hospitalists can care for the patients better if they're there in the hospital all day. There doesn't supplant for a physician knowing his patient or her patient, but
yeah, I mean,
overall,
there's the distinction between the technical caring of the patient and the relationship-based caring for the patient.
And it boils down to money. I mean, again, we're driven when in most hospitals are about 3,500 to 4,000 a day in California, and so if you save 1 or 2 days on a bunch of admissions, it adds up to quite a bit of money.
But as I mentioned yesterday, the movement towards team care approach, the team approach to care, and why can't we sort of envision a team between the patient's ongoing physician and the physicians who are actually based in the hospital? Why can't that be part of a team that we can?
It's all a matter of communication, just like in all facets of our lives. If the communication is good, there can be that back and forth, but sometimes that's not the case. I did want to say one other thing. For many of these things, people would kind of want to organize medicine to assist. And I have to tell everyone to keep in mind, organized medicine, like many other things, in many aspects has been bought out by the corporate practice of medicine. And what is good for the individual physician is not necessarily good for the larger medical group. And some of these things come into tension, and organized medicine cannot be counted on to do it. So I don't know where you go. Remember, the AMA only has 16% of physician members nationwide, less than 1 in 5. California Medical Association is very similar. They pump their numbers up with medical students and retired doctors. And so you really can't count on the unequivocal support of organized medicine. They have other priorities, like keeping their doors open by getting membership fees from large groups. And those goals are often different than the profession's goals.
Dr. Sobers.
To follow on the last comment, I think another lever, another place is the organized medical staff of the hospital. Because under the regulations, they have the right to determine privileges and such. And it seems to me like they have not exercised that very well. It takes a lot to get rid of a doctor from a hospital, but I could imagine that you could put in some of the things that we're talking about here as the criteria for continued privileges in a hospital, and use that as both an incentive, but also as a device to get people to do the right thing. And the reason this is on the front is in 10 years or so, or whatever I've been on the Metro Health Board, I only recall one case where the medical staff came up and said, this person has to go, and suspended their privileges, and the board concurred, and the person's gone. Why doesn't that happen more? Out of thousands of docs running through the place, that there's going to be some issues of, if nothing else, just certainly bad quality, but not being an advocate for your patient the way you're supposed to be. So the question is, how do you do that? What do you do? And then the internal politics of a medical staff are tough, not quite as bad as the whole organized medicine, but that's a lever. The point is, and we can hold the medical staff responsible because they want to do that. They want to be responsible for it. They jealously hang on to it. And so let's make them more responsible,
Yeah,
they don't have to be unionized to do it necessarily. They can do it. They've already got the right.
Yeah, this is, I think, Dr. Batante's theme. Much of your theme is how can, physicians have power. I mean, they need more, perhaps they need it in different ways, but they have power in medical staffs and state medical boards and so on. So we need to look to those bodies to achieve some of these, to move in some of these directions, right? I know a bit about the law of medical staffs, and part of the problem is that they have been basically, the law has defanged them in deference to the governing boards of the hospital and the administrative, parts of, the chief of medicine and all of those, the vice president for this and that. That's certainly a problem. Dr. Batanji.
Professor Melman, I'm going to sort of buttress Professor Hall's comments, but in a little different way, recognizing that 70% of physicians are employed now. And so, looking at it from an older model of practice is still, it has to be done, but it's going to be less effective because you're only looking at the 30% that still have the independent voice. The 70% that are employed have obviously other problems. You're employed, you have a duty to your boss. You've got all the psychological baggage of doing what your boss tells you. Heavy crimes have been done because your boss told you to do it. And so at this point in time, physician unionization becomes even more important. But what Professor Hall was talking about, increasing the liability for a dysfunctional system where the leadership I won't say make, but tries to influence physician behavior in such a way either to induce restricting care or delaying patient care should have some increased penalties to deter that behavior, because then everybody is in the same boat. It's going to take resources from them collectively. So I think that's an important part as well. We've got all these, you can't have inducements, but they still do it. So how are you going to stop it if it's already against the law and they still induce it? One way to do it is it costs more to do it. And the other thing that Professor Hall said, how do you get around the ERISA preemption, which is a hell of a deterrent to bringing any sort of legal remedy.
And the ERISA deterrent you're referring to is the ERISA for self-insured employer plans. Basically, they're preempted from state law regulation. So even if we make changes in state laws, some of the ones I suggested yesterday, those don't necessarily apply or don't apply to ERISA self-insured employer plans. Right.
So here's a comment from Mary Lou. Is there a difference between community hospitals and academic medical centers? Power of the physicians? How the physicians are organized? How are they educated? How they view patient care?
Well, we've talked, Mary Lou, about a number of those topics. Is there any comment on the distinction between academic medical centers and other types of hospital systems? I don't know if that, that suggests any directions for us.
Big one is the academic medical centers are going to be almost all salaried. They're almost all salaried, and you're going to have still some community centers that have independent docs running around. So my guess is of the 20 or whatever they're left, they're mostly in those smaller facilities now.
I'm embarrassed to ask this question because I teach this stuff. I should know the answer, but we talk about the 70% of physicians who are employed. Does that include physicians who are part of a group practice which has a contractual affiliation with the hospital? Does that come under the rubric of employment? Because I know from my studies of hospital medical staff relationships with the board, there are doctors who are directly employed, hospitalists and others, but there are also doctors who, upon whom enormous pressure can be exerted by the hospital by threatening to, revoke the contract of the group that's providing, that's staffing the ER or other parts of the hospital, practice. And so is that a separate category, or is that what we include in the 70%?
My understanding is that the doctors who have concessions at the hospital are still independent practitioners and are counted as not employed. However, some of those practices will employ physicians. In other words, they're not owners of the practice. So let's say emergency room department is run by XYZ medical group. That medical group is still considered independent because they're not employed. However, some of those physicians in that practice will be employed by the practice.
By the medical group.
By the medical group, yes.
Okay. So it's really quite Byzantine.
Yes.
Which I would expect, since lawyers are
helping making this happen.
Yeah.
I want to go back to at the same time that JB referenced what the title of this conference is, I was also looking at it and thinking about the same thing. I want to go back 30 years. I had a family medicine colleague who came up with the idea that that a specialist should not be paid for consultation unless she or he had actually sent the results of that consultation back to the primary care physician. So, I mean, and that was obviously pre-electronic medical records. That is now available on a routine basis. I bring this up because also decades ago, I had the notion that if there were hospitalists, and this was actually before there were hospitalists, that they needed to communicate with the primary care physician who actually knew the patient over time and had a fidelity relationship with the patient. If we're doing shift work now and hospital shift work, in fact, there ought to be not just you can read the results of what we did after the fact, but in fact, a duty to contact and learn from the primary physician who actually knows the patient and cares for her or him. I mean, that.
Yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, some part of the cause of that problem is the fraud and abuse laws. The prohibition on payment for referrals, and so if the primary care doctor is having some relationship with a doctor, a specialist, say, the concern may be that if the primary care doctor is being paid for any of that relationship, it may be a self-referral or a referral problem or a kickback problem. I think there may be a legal problem there. But I know Fred has his hand up.
I just wanted to put a plug in for a previous comment about self-regulation and the frame of power and physicians having power within certain segments. I mean, this is part of what's important about self-regulation is that it has a huge public face, meaning when it doesn't go well, it plays out in the media as whether it's sensationalized or not, as an example of physicians closing ranks and not placing the welfare of patients first. And so the degree to which you can tackle problems on the list, on the board, in terms of which are more visible to the public as making statements to the public that we're working on your behalf, and which of those activities are going to be by their very nature more private and therefore less public, might be an overall strategy. The one other comment, your comments have taken me back to the title of this conference.
and they advocates for their patients. I'm reminded for myself that I do not have a primary care physician anymore. And the only way I can have one is a workaround, which I do by virtue of being an insider in a system. But what I have is a team. But the team is not the team like, sorry, since there have been so many sports metaphors, like a baseball team, where I can get a card and it says, these are your team. These are the team members. Membership of the team changes all the time too. So in effect, yeah, you're team-based care, but you're seeing whomever you're seeing at the time you come in, and 99% of the interactions are in effect with strangers.
Excellent point. One thing that has been mentioned in passing, and it's interesting to me that it's only been in passing, is electronic medical records. I know when I first raised the subject with the students in my healthcare controversies class and said, what are the impediments to professionalism? That was one thing that a number of them mentioned, is the burden of electronic medical records. And we heard about, the doctors who were staying, hours after, they leave their offices, but they're still working on their records. And any thoughts on that? I mean, Dr. Letterman?
Well, I think we misnamed these instruments. They're not records, they're billing instruments. So they're designed primarily to extract as much payment as you possibly can from whoever is covering the healthcare costs. And they are difficult to use. The concept of drop-down menus which are there in order to try to make them accurate, are an impediment to actual work. And they are loaded with inaccuracies. Histories are typically cut and pasted from a prior event and placed in the current event. And I know a bit about this because in 1989, we designed an electronic medical record for research and care at the HIV clinic at university hospitals. We implemented it in 1994, and it does not bill, but is an exquisitely simple instrument that takes usually fewer than 3 minutes for the physician to fill out at the end of a meeting. And it provides accurate information on events as they occur. And it's been a research tool that has generated hundreds and hundreds of research publications and is the regular management tool for patient care at the University Hospital Special Immunology Unit. It works really well. And it is not all electronic. It is paper. It is a part of it. And with each visit, the physician gets a paper summary of what has happened to the patient, critical meds, critical problems, allergies, events, summaries of radiographs, because we can't afford to actually show the radiographs. The cost software there is exquisitely expensive. And at the end of the interview, the physician simply ticks off or by hand drops the things that have ended, writes in the things that are new if necessary, or new meds with a crayon, and a data manager transcribes that accurately into the record. Physicians are terrible when it comes to accurately demonstrating things that happen, but the data manager is trained to do this. It works well and provides care to more than 1,200 persons with HIV at any one time.
Other thoughts on medical records? I mean, we had a conference just a few years ago here. Well, one of our annual Law Medicine Center conferences was on the problems of electronic medical records. And it was really, for me in particular, it was very, very eye-opening. One of the things I learned, for example, is that the vendors of medical record systems make it illegal to download any of their screens. So one of the problems that our speakers had was having PowerPoints that showed a screen from an actual, medical record system and showing us what the problems were. And I won't, without identifying who they were, some of them basically ignored that prohibition and did it anyway. And we saw, for example, talking about drop-down menus, a drop-down menu for patient diagnosis, and there were like 7, possible diagnoses. Except the problem was that without any indication of it, there were 6 more below the bottom of the screen, and there was no way that the physician would know that, and why is this, what are one of the big problems that was identified, or what reasons for these problems is how these systems are beta tested. And they are beta tested with physicians, but with physicians who have an affinity and expertise in computers. And electronic record systems. So it's the teaching them themselves, which is not a very good indicator of how friendly those systems are for physicians who are not particularly they don't spend all their free time on video games and so forth. So but we haven't really talked much about that in terms of the. If anybody has any thoughts or comments, Dr. Kurz.
Just a couple to go a little bit further with your comments. I've never seen software so bug-ridden in my life. Nobody would tolerate this on their website, and we're doing patient work with it, making decisions based on that. That's one comment. The second comment is I started EHR in my office because I didn't want to pay for storage of medical records. I had bought someone else's practice, and I didn't want to do that. And I started in 2004, before all the mandates came out. As soon as the government got involved and they started making all these little boxes you needed to tick in order to get paid for the EHR, of course, the EHR vendors went in that direction because they wanted everybody to be able to collect the money. So that went through. Then what became even worse is this thing called MIPS, where basically you're checking boxes all over the place so you don't get a 10% cut in Medicare or 9%, whatever it is. So what the EHR has been a cudgel to the doctors. I don't care what your mode of practice is if you're not doing the ticks on the box, you're not going to get paid. And it has nothing to do with patient care. It is just an exercise in finances.
And so, the tension that keeps coming to my mind is the tension between making these changes. So you could imagine electronic medical records being introduced to improve quality, to improve patient care. But you can also, as we've identified, they were introduced in order to maximize a billing potential, right? Not just simple, but maximize it. And the tension between those two objectives is behind a number of these problems.
And let's not all be negative. I mean, the American Academy of Ophthalmology has worked and set up a big registry called the IRIS registry, and everyone who uses EHR and participates in the registry uploads their data automatically into it, which allows for excellent research capabilities. So it's not all negative, but using it as a cudgel for finances, I don't know where that fits in with law and restoring the medical professionalism, but becoming data entry clerks is not the way to become a medical professional. And so until we fix that particular problem, doctors are going to be staying up at night and typing in records. I spend about 2 hours after I go home finishing my notes because it just needs to be done. And just to end on a light note, one of my colleagues said that EHR was the best birth control he had ever seen.
All this nonsense is really not necessary. It's not that hard to generate an electronic healthcare record that is effective and easy to use. Bozos like us did it and launched in '94, and it's been functioning extremely well since then. What's more, other institutions around the country that are involved in HIV care have had almost a parallel evolution. As an example, University of Alabama Birmingham's program established a very similar program that evolved the way that ours did. And when I was more engaged in the Centers for AIDS Research, we established a consortium of 9 medical centers around the country that applied programs like this. Those that didn't have it borrowed ours or borrowed University of Alabama's, developed it, and then we share our data. And it now provides exquisite and detailed follow-up on more than 30,000 patients with HIV disease around the country. So it can be done, and it can be done at minimal expense and really, really well. But again, it does not bill. And once you add the necessity to tick off the boxes for billing and have specific ICD-9 codes or whatever they are right now, then all the beauty and simplicity of the system, again, 2 to 3 minutes at the end of with a crayon, that's all the physician needs to do with the data set, and the data are entered accurately. The stuff we do right now is actually, it's fraudulent because much of it is wrong. And I don't remember who said this. Maybe a better way to say this is it's almost wrong.
Professor Silvers.
First of all, let me just comment a couple. One, the MIPS thing that you mentioned, it's for docs who are not in an organized alternative medical or an attorney practice. And it's, in my view.
Is your microphone on, by the way? I don't. Okay. I couldn't hear you.
Got to turn my voice up. I've got a throat problem. So the it's designed, although they don't admit it, to force doctors into an organized or a medical payment, alternative payment process, become part of an ACO or whatever, or join the board, basically, if you go back to that. And it's stupid. It's just dumb. It never has worked. But this is a case, it seems to me, where we force the system, a legitimate forcing of the system. The High-Tech Act was designed to get data that can be used for quality purposes. That was the whole idea. That was the rationale for why they wanted to do it. But they never specified how to do it. So you had the techies that took over without the physicians involved, and they just did what they thought was the right thing to do. We've lost the interface there. And it wouldn't have happened in most other businesses. I think we would have been able to figure that out. The ATMs is not a great example, but parallel, but not a bad one. ATMs, if you remember the very early days, you had to use one ATM for your card. Well, there's a company that created a backbone for that. So you think you're going to KeyCorp or someplace, you're actually going to, I just lost the name. I want to say PsyCorp, it's something like that. It's a backbone, and they share all that with a front end that's consistent for all the people. Is there a technical solution? Of course there is. You know, partly it's because we didn't, for competitive reasons, we didn't want to make interchangeable records, because I want to hang on to my patients. So when I was at UH, FARA insisted on doing something other than Epic. It didn't really matter what it was. It just couldn't be part of Epic because the other guys had Epic, you know. And then we got Epic, and Epic wasn't done very well in lots of ways. And you had multiple. They were trying to be flexible, so they let you put the data in 5 different places. And when you try to pull it out, it looks like you didn't do it, but it's in another record form. You know, we just have screwed up the technical side of this thing. The principle is not a bad principle. We got data. It's just the execution is just awful.
Hang on
That's
one second. Professor Roll, did you want to? Okay. Go ahead, Dr. Letterman.
That's absolutely right. And this is a painful part of my history, because when University Hospitals was considering the purchase of an electronic medical record system, we had already had one that was working well. And we took a look at Allscripts. It's a damn disaster. It was a nightmare. It was so easy to tell that it was dysfunctional. And you're absolutely right. It's not difficult to have a front end that is unique, and then have I don't know whether it's called a metadata system that is downstream, that is standardized, to which all contribute. And that's just the way we do it in the CFAR CNICS program. And it could be done broadly and universally. But the problem, the major problem to my mind, is the physician interface, which is completely dysfunctional and takes too much time and is, again, inaccurate.
I think I've touched a sensitive nerve. Although I'm not quite sure. I mean, we can certainly see how it is an impediment to, a patient, to being able to do what you should be doing for your patients, instead of, being so frustrated and time consumed. But go ahead.
I think this is a perfect moment to share the article I brought in from Don Berwick for Dr. Letterman. And it's basically from competition to cooperation or collaboration. I mean, we have a system that's set up for competition. We're not going to get where we need to go if we don't change the MO to collaboration and cooperation.
Does his article suggest how we achieve that?
Yes, but it's not easy.
All right. Any other thoughts, something that we should add to our list? Any other comments on the things that are on our list? Yes, pass it.
Okay.
Bob, wait, you need a microphone. And again, identify yourself because we don't have a name.
Sure. My name is Shenzo Chodala, and I'm an attorney in Youngstown area, an area that I think you're all familiar with now, Youngstown, Ohio, right? I feel somewhat intimidated. I'm the only non-professor and non-doctor in the room. Nevertheless, I'd like to present a question based on some fact patterns, some real life fact pattern. My friend, OBGYN, a couple of weeks ago, I'm at dinner with him and he says to me, I just had a problem. I tried to call to get pre-approval, pre-authorization for an MRI because I'm going to do a hysterectomy. And they said they said no. And then we disputed it. And then they spoke to a second person and they said no. And I asked him why he felt that he needed to do the MRI. And he indicated that after 40 years of practice and doing thousands of hysterectomies, he felt that the following, and I apologize for reading. His reason was additional imaging is often needed to better delineate the anatomy prior to surgery to avoid any intraoperative surprises and eliminate any unexpected deviation from the planned procedure. In other words, that was his reason as a OBGYN with 40 years of practice and a lot of hysterectomies. That was his reason for asking for an MRI. Now, the person that said, I asked, well, was there a OBGYN for the insurance company that made the decision? He said, no, it was a nurse practitioner. And my feeling of doctors, and as I've often expressed to my brother-in-law, Bob Batanti here, is that I ask if they've had a year with a cadaver. And if they haven't, then I want to go to someone who has. That's just my personal opinion. But the question is, his question is, what does he do in that situation? That's fact one. Fact two is, I've been a practicing attorney for 40 years, and I've had calls from clients for different issues. I've had hundreds of calls from clients who say, I want to sue my doctor or the hospital for malpractice. And I said, well, what did they do wrong? I don't know, but I got a bad result. So a bad result occurred, so I want to sue. And out of those hundreds in 40 years, there were two that were real malpractice cases that resulted in an admission of malpractice. And the others were just a bad result, so I want to sue somebody. So those are the two facts. Now, what does he do? So my question is to the professors: what options does he have to deal with it? And asking Bob from an advocacy standpoint, what should he be doing to advocate for his patient?
Right. So, we talked quite a bit about the problems of prior authorization yesterday, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it after our break. There is supposedly a process for getting a review of that decision, right, within the plan, right, the nurse practitioner's decision, right. By the way, I think my understanding is your doctor is lucky that it was a nurse practitioner, not just a computer algorithm that rejected the request. But there's an internal review within the there's a right to internal review within the managed care plan, and then there is a newly established right to an external review. I'm going to talk more about that after the break. Tell you what not only what little I know, but what little apparently anybody knows about how that works. because I think that's one of the big issues that we might want to tackle. But anyway, as far as the malpractice, I mean, I'm actually surprised that there were so many patients who contacted you thinking that they had a malpractice claim. My understanding from research is the opposite, that there are all these patients, who it doesn't work very well for them, but they're not even sure that it didn't work well for them because of anything that the doctor did or didn't do, much less are they in a position to evaluate whether what the doctor didn't do might generate liability for the doctor. And so, we have the studies from the Harvard, project back in the 80s, which found, I think, that, some extremely small percentage of patients whose hospital records revealed frank malpractice and bad outcome, actually ever understood that they had been, that they had been harmed by malpractice in the hospital. And, that I think it was 1 out of 10 sort of realized there might be some issue there. And out of those, only 1 out of 6 ever got any kind of compensation. So, the system, my impression is it's the opposite, that people, don't know that they might have a claim, but clearly from the other standpoint, as we heard yesterday, the burden of malpractice liability is a shadow that, is cast on all of the relationships between physicians and patients. Although, as a point that I made, and I think Sarah also alluded to, and that is, we know that the patients who have good relationships with their physicians are more forgiving. And perhaps even in appropriate circumstances where the physicians admit that gosh, I screwed up. How can I make this right for you? I will fix this at no charge. I will send you to someone who, so there are ways to establish and maintain a good relationship that has a very positive effect on the risk of liability. Anything else at this point? Otherwise, I propose we take a 15-minute break. What I want to return to discuss is, where do we go from here? We've got a lot of good ideas. How can we make some of them, all of them, how can we pursue them? So think about that as you have your break, and then we'll come back at 11:45. Pardon?
Yeah, I have an email.
our postdoc, Rebecca Smith. One of her jobs these last 2 days has been to take notes. She will be preparing a draft of what I'm referring to as a white paper based on the conference. If anyone is interested in, I would hope that some of you would be willing to take the time to review a draft of the white paper and give us, comments and corrections and so forth. And then that white paper will be eventually published in our health law journal, Health Matrix, but that won't be for a year. In the meantime, I propose to circulate it and welcome suggestions on to whom should we send it, with who is the courier. And then Dr. Batanti, Professor Hall and I, and another law professor from Georgia State will be presenting the results of this conference to the annual conference of the health law professors, which is going to, it's a part of the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. And so about 250 law professors will show up in Arizona in June, and we have a panel session. And we will be describing what we have done here and welcoming, further assistance and ideas. So, yes.
I would just add to Bob's action items, not only organized medicine, but almost all the physicians belong to their specialty societies. And so if a particular item has a special, rings true for one or a few of the specialty societies, that is an avenue to get things into Washington, D.C., where, of course, much of this work needs to be done. And I think you get a lot more uptake with specialty societies because most of them have pretty good lobbying and connections in DC. I did want to add one thing to the list that probably is on the other side of the board, or at least been erased, is to educate and perhaps provide some changes to the surprise billing story that's been told in the media and in the political circles. It's not all what it's been told. It's been very much payer-centered with the cover of patients' protection. If you really get into the nitty-gritty, which is very tough, there's a lot of nuance in there. There's a lot of expectation that physicians with high levels of training are going to be at call on low prices for managed care plans and for large hospital systems who don't want to fund physicians on call. This is especially common in urban and rural areas that is not mentioned, and it's just not part of the equation because it's not sexy. And so this will lead over time to a lack of specialty care in emergency situations. And it just requires sticking people on helicopters, which are not cheap, and then sending them into cities. And so that's, it's just a story that is too complicated, but it needs to be honed, communicated, and then changed in terms of a lot of the things that are going on with the rulemaking.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that we will face in going to specialty societies is the extent to which we are bolstering or trying to bolster primary care, and to the extent to which that's viewed as a kind of antithetical direction for specialists and so on. So we have to figure out a way of making it clear that this is not at anybody's expense. This is to the benefit of all.
I think that there's a lot more synergy between specialists and primary care than's often attributed.
Dr. Frizoff, do you have a comment? You have your microphone.
Basically, I think the key audience you need to reach out to is people in medical school education. The whole concept of fidelity and that you have an obligation to your patient. The legal and historical aspects of it, I think, really needs to be pounded in, if you will, to the younger generations.
My impression is that medical school curricula are largely governed. I mean, they're controlled by the medical schools themselves, although they have to meet certain, they have to cover certain things so the students can pass their boards and so on. Am I wrong? Or does the American, the American College of, what is it? The American Association of Medical Schools, do they dictate, the content of curricula? In other words, is there a centralized focus of, focal point for this? Or do we have to go to, every medical school and pitch, you got to add to this to your curriculum? Fred, do you have a comment on that?
You have to go to every medical school. The LCME sets out accreditation standards, the AAMC. LCME is owned by the AAMC and the AMA, but as in setting curricula, it's a school by school issue.
Does the AAMC issue sort of recommendations? I mean, so if we got them on board for, any of this, is there a way that they can sort of urge their members to do something? I mean, do they ever do that sort of thing?
I mean, I suppose so. The AAMC in essence is a trade organization representing all of the medical schools. That's how it functions. But your earlier comments about curricular tightness, I mean, in the 45 years that I've been working in medical schools, two things get fought over constantly. One is control of laboratory or research space, but the other one is curricular hours. It's an ongoing process. And curriculum revisions take place constantly. So, you may be able to acquire a footprint, but it'll also be an ongoing battle.
Dr. Batanti.
Professor Melman, there's, I think, a new battleground that's shown up, which is through advertising. And who do you trust is the ultimate question. You get an ad from this person, come to us, we give you great care. Come to us, we do exotic care. Come to us. But I never know who us is, and I never really know what the promise is. In the early 1900s, the American Medical Association routinely ran public service announcements. And I think maybe it's time to double down on the fidelity issue, because as a physician, I never heard about fidelity one time, but as a lawyer, I did. Now that seems something seems wrong with that. If fidelity has been in our credo since 1847, and I had to go to law school to hear about fidelity. So maybe it's time to double down so that people know who they really can trust. And we're promising, physicians are promising you fidelity, and we have only your interest at heart. I think it's time to say it, and say it publicly, unequivocally again.
Yeah, I had an idea some years ago that one of the ways to move forward with this is to encourage competition between physician practices over fidelity. So that you would be able to say, here's what I do for my patients. Here's why you should come to me, because I go the extra mile to make sure that you get what you need and stuff like that. I wasn't thinking of a sort of harmful competition. I was thinking of a way of spurring physicians to do more of this because they would fear being left behind. But yeah, public relations is outreach, public service announcements. One thing that no one's mentioned, and I kind of kick myself for this, is continuing medical education. We've talked about all the things that are missing from medical school. How much of this takes place in CME? Wouldn't that be, and we can, so this program is offering continuing medical education credit, right? It takes some effort and some money to get, to be allowed to give continuing medical education credit, but what a good idea. We should create modules that physicians can do online, for example, and we can help them understand this and give them, tools to do this, right?
The medical school here, you can probably, we already have it accredited, right? Or
yes, it is.
Yeah, it's already accredited.
Right. So other thoughts at this point? Yeah, a microphone for JB.
I was thinking before of education efforts with regard to medical staffs, my comment before, but also hospital boards and others about their responsibility for this. We were just talking about this at the break in terms of how this works. And to pick up your advertising thing, there's a thing called Ethisphere that for some reason around here, the three major health systems have all gotten involved in it. And it's a fairly extensive thing that you have to work really hard to get certified by this external organization as one of the world's most ethical companies. And Ethisphere. And I think I remember I didn't read it, but I think the Metro thing was like 400 pages of application, certification, processes, everything else that you're trying to do, of which I assume some of what we talked about today is in there, but I don't know. But the argument is that you can then, it goes back to your marketing question, you use that for marketing, that this is an ethical organization that's doing the right things, presumably for the patients, but also for the people that work there and other sorts of things. And there's even potential for money. One of the things I learned by experience when I was running Qualtrics Health Plan here was that J.D. Powers came in and did an assessment of the health plans in Cleveland. And I got a call or a letter from them saying, congratulations, you are the best health plan in Cleveland. This is really terrific. And if you'd like to tell anybody that you are, send us a check for $72,000 or whatever the number was, something like that. And I thought, oh, you got to be kidding me, really? So I asked for all their data and their process, and I looked at it and I thought, well, they did a good job. I think it's true. The data is real. So then I went back to the system and said, do you think we should spend $72,000? And the answer was yes. And so for a year, we got to tell people that we were really great. And then I thought, right then, I'm in the wrong business. I should definitely be in this. But, you do something like that and then you make money and they advertise your product. This is even better. This is true. But could you do that with I am patient oriented? Not the New York Times list of the world of the best doctors in New York City, but the ones that do the best according to the certification. So certification, I guess, is the bottom line, and advertising, to pick up in your comment, is another way to get some leverage out of it.
And I mean, we've talked off and on about the quality metrics that are being, used by Medicare, for example, for some of its, new payment systems and so on. Is there a way to create a quality metric for patient fidelity? We have, one of the metrics is patient satisfaction with surveys, and we know the weaknesses and strengths of that. But what about trying to create metrics for fidelity? How much time did your medical staff spend advocating for patients? And now part of it would reflect how much are they billing under Bob's new code. But anyway, interesting thing to think about.
And
Yeah, Fred.
I'll piggyback on a language in medicine is quality and the relationship to quality metrics. So yeah, if you can tag a way of thinking about fidelity in some kind of quality metrics way, that sounds good. I'll take it from there going back. The advertising and the mention of the $72,000. I have no idea how you would do it at all, but medical schools are driven by rankings. U.S. News and World Report drives an awful lot of what goes on in medical schools, at least certain medical schools who want to protect their rankings. The metrics that are involved in any kind of best whatever, although U.S. News and World Report is in the rankings business. You fail as a news magazine and you succeed as a rankings business. If you can figure a way there, that's great. And then finally, I mean, I'm an academic. The coin of the realm in my world is what appears in the medical education literature. And the degree to which you can change the language of within medical education in, for example, a shift from what has become, at least for medical students, a dirty word, altruism, and you can substitute Fidelity for altruism, and figure a way of doing that through the medical education literature. And I can already imagine a series of articles in a variety of different ways. You might be able to change the conversation within medical education circles with respect to Fidelity.
Great. Yes.
Am I allowed to make a quick
On your
remark?
own?
On my
Absolutely.
own?
That's amazing.
I've loved the conversation. It's just stimulated my brain cells. I've been thinking. I know I'm not going to sleep tonight. And I know I'm going to talk about that code. I teach a class in healthcare finance, and I'm going to talk about that code this week because we've just finished off our Medicare and Medicaid section. And it would be one of the cases that we're going to be looking at are the dual Kreisig cases, talking about the problem with physicians spending so much time on medical records and on advocating for their patients and not being able to get compensated for that. So thank you so much for that. But I just wanted to build on some of the things that folks have been saying here just right now, is that in my area of governance, risk management, and compliance, there is a relatively new phenomenon that's is just racing across the globe. In ESG metrics, environmental, social, and governance metrics, where we've got external private organizations that are rating companies based upon, so that investors can make socially responsible investment choices. And these are racing around the world, particularly in the area of an environmental, your supply chains, are they environmentally sustainable? Are your supply chains using, child labor? Are your supply chains engaging in human trafficking? And so I just wanted to say that particularly as we're thinking about private equity, but if there was a way to build in your concepts of fidelity into, how these external organizations are valuing companies, and certainly the most ethical, that is right in there. The code of ethics. The code of ethics includes this, right, already in hospitals across the country. That if there was a way to tap into that, you were thinking about levers, a way to tap into that other phenomenon so that it could happen at the same time. I think that would be one way to add to this whole conversation. So once again, thank you so much for allowing me to be here to listen. It's just been fascinating.
I know that Dr. Curtis, you have to leave, and the conversation will continue. But my question for you is, think about whether you would be willing to continue to be part of the conversation. Okay.
Absolutely.
So
I hope to get some papers to review, but I did want to make one comment
about
the issues here. I think we all have to keep in mind.
Jamie, can we grab that microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, of course.
Of course, much of this is regional, but many people choose their healthcare based on what their employer gives them. So, I know we can have academic talks about fidelity and that sort of thing, but many people just are going to go where they're told to go. And that's, that unfortunately, that's the system. Much of what it is in California, the patients get a card and they're just going to follow the card. I subscribed to the triple A's, which most of us in medical school heard, which is the reason people like doctors is the number one thing is that they're affable, and the second one is that they're available, and the last thing they care about is ability. And so the people just want to like their doctors, and many times we have these ideas of the fidelity and things, and I think they're very, they're very principled, but the practicality for a lot of patients is they just need to go where they go. And I like Bob's idea about educating the community that a physician is the one in our tenants who have fidelity. We have the fiduciary responsibility. Most of the other people in the healthcare system are employees, and they do not have that. And I think keeping things simple and making it so that the general public understands it is where we gain our biggest ground.
Great. Dr. Patandi.
I saved this kind of towards the end, Professor, because it takes this concept even a little bit farther. As a medical student and a resident and a practicing physician, I never heard Fidelity. I had mentioned that before. So until I went to law school, that I had never heard of Fidelity and fiduciary duties. But in fact, the thing that really attracts me to the law is their real commitment to clients, their undivided commitment to clients, and the old term, zealous advocacy to clients. That, to me, is the essence of what I want a doctor to be for me. I want him to not just be my doctor, I want him to be a zealous advocate for me. And so, and even within the law, that zealous advocacy has been attacked as being too strong. I think it's, what separates lawyers from, any other kind of advocacy. It's zealous and single purposed. There's been some argument it doesn't belong in medicine, and yet you can find some philosophers that have stated that a physician has the exact same obligation. And so I'd like to promote that. That is a doctor's obligation. It's zealous, it's uncompromised, and it's fidelity to the hilt. And just like Dr. Kura said, it's time to tell the public that so that they're not misled. And it's also time to hold physicians' feet to the fire if they're not zealous advocates.
While we're passing the mic, Dr. Frizoff, on this point or on a different point?
On this point,
Go ahead, please.
somewhat off it, but mostly on it. My father was a lawyer and was advanced in age when I became a doctor. And his constant question to me was, if you have a problem with a patient, do you have someone to go to? Sort of, he recognized that, my skill set was not enough, that I needed other people around to go to. So, I mean, I think that whether we call it zealous advocacy or something else, it's both to an individual and to a team. And we have to figure out how to do that. I mean, the alternative to that is what's getting more and more prevalent, which is shift work, which is, I do my bit and then INSTPA. So I think it's, how is our zealous advocacy both done by individuals and recognition that there has to be teams with the complexity of what we now know.
Yeah, a few years ago, I had exactly that idea to do research on in team care, who should patients trust? And I pitched a project to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And I had federally qualified health centers here in Cleveland standing by to allow us to go interview patients and interview team members and find out what's happening and then figure out if there were ways to go from there. And not only didn't I get funded, but RWJ created its own trust project, none of which had to do with this. And so don't get me started. And I hope no one from RWJ is listening, because otherwise you're great. And one of our alums is the general counsel, the head of our alumni board. But anyway, very good, very important. How do we promote fidelity? Because I think teams are here to, I don't think we can, turn the clock back. JB.
This is the last comment before was interesting. It made me think about the issue. When I got involved with doing the expert testimony, for instance, remember, I testified for Eddie Edwards in the former governor of Louisiana in his RICO trial, his first RICO trial. And my mother said, "Well, you're against him, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, no, he's a scoundrel, but no, for this particular thing, what he did was not against the law." The insight I'm driving at is that we depend in the legal profession advocacy on both sides. It's an adversarial situation. That makes it, and it works. I mean, I'm fully supportive of that. That's not necessarily what we have in the medical side. So what we're talking, when we use the word advocate here in the medical sense, we're advocating on one side, but there's nobody advocating on the other side. So the parallel, and I was sitting there thinking, well, how could you do that? Can you have somebody arguing the other side of excess utilization, for instance, you know? And we sort of do that. We have committees and, you know, we have budgets and stuff like that, but it's not really the same thing. So the analogy of being an unbridled advocate has some limits in terms of research reality. And so that's the tough part, is that's where I go back to an organizational question rather than a pure legal adversary relationship. So can we create something in the organizational structure to meet the same goals, to do the same thing, to make that organization an ethical organization that's doing the right thing for the patient? Can we get them, you know, get them educated, stuff we were talking about before, Catherine, you know, we do things to get them to act the right way, so that within that, the patient, the doctor can be the advocate, but within the limits that are reasonable. So maybe I'm talking my way through this. Maybe the question here is, can we have organizational limits that are established that do not infringe on the advocacy question of the doctor in an inappropriate way? And pre-admission certifications, you know, second opinions, all that sort of stuff, we probably go too far in many ways for the wrong reason. But to the extent that there really are resource constraints, you got to do it somehow or another. So how do we balance that out? I think there's a nuance there that we don't want to throw away.
Definitely. Definitely. Thank you. Fred, you have your hand up, I see.
Yeah, just going back to your story about RWJ and their trust initiative. Yesterday, you had for a short period Daniel Wolfson joining you as the director of the ABIM Foundation. Their principal initiative right now is trust. And so the degree to which you might want to establish some kind of partnership with what's going on here and what some of the things that are going on within the ABIM. I'm not primarily part of that conversation. I mean, I know Daniel, but their trust initiative is their singular focus right now.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Excellent. So let me sort of make some suggestions, and I throw out some ideas in our remaining time. So some thoughts. So I think we would all agree that many of, if not all of these proposals are worth pursuing somehow, right? And the question now is, how do we do that? How can that be done? And I think some of these ideas are, if you will, no-brainers, like getting all states to adopt the legal protections that only some states or some courts have put into place. And a number of these other steps, we could flip it over again, require changes in the law, require affecting court opinions. And so, how do you change the law? Lobbying effort. We need the ability to pitch ideas to those, because we're not lobbyists, right? To pitch ideas to the appropriate organizations and individuals who have the power to influence legislation. And in terms of courts, I think it would be a good idea if there were a capability to contribute amicus briefs in appropriate cases, right? Generate the briefs, get people to sign on. Zeke Emanuel got some terrific mileage out of 200 people, more than 200 people saying we need more COVID funding. You may have seen that on the news, right? He pitched that to a bunch of us. And anyway, so that's one thing. And so we need to think about how can we mobilize organizations with lobbying capability and power to achieve some of these results. Some of the ideas, I think, are not quite no-brainers. They need further elaboration, right? So For example, I threw out the idea yesterday of the need for a new type of professional called a medical advocate. And one question is, how would they be paid? Right? I said, don't make the patients pay for them because that's too limited. Should they be paid by the government, Medicare? It could be. Should they be paid by the health providers, the health plans, and so on? We don't have. If we were interested in pursuing that, it would be interesting to try to mount a demonstration project. Let's see different ways of doing this, which works best. So the idea of the ability to do research, empirical research, right? The big elephant, one of the big elephants in the room is, how do we determine what is medically necessary so that physicians can advocate for that, but not exceed that in ways that are primarily for the physician's self-interest. And so someone has to decide what is medically necessary. And Bob pointed out the potential role of state medical boards in doing this. We have external review organizations, and I don't know that much about them. I've done some research with Rebecca to try to find out about them. And one of the things we found is that nobody knows about them. There's very, very little, there's virtually no research on those external review organizations, right? So everybody understand what they write. So request for approval, prior authorization denied by the plan, go through internal plan review. You then have the right to external review. There are a variety of different types of organizations that are authorized to do that, independent review organizations, IROs and others. Rob, can I have my slides? Because I have a little. So, how do they make these judgment calls? Okay, we're not.
Any of these companies are like arbitrators, after a while, they get incestuous with the people purchasing.
Well, okay, so it turns out there is an elaborate set of rules for these organizations that Medicare has established. Yeah, if you could bring that up. That Medicare has established, and they have to engage the services of an independent physician expert in the qualified in the field, and there are rules for how they determine that. But one thing I couldn't find is is there some kind of majority vote? Does it end up with the equivalent of the health plan, the IRO equivalent of a medical director who has the final say? All we know about external reviews, and this is all we could find, it's extraordinary, 1% of plan denials are appealed, 0.1% are appealed of plan denials for a market, exchange plans are appealed. 60% are decided in favor of patients. This is internal reviews. For external reviews, this is only data from Ohio from 2000. I couldn't find it from anywhere else. There's two kinds of reviews, standard and expedited, right? Expedited is for, emergent 72-hour turnaround time, although that seems, too long for a lot of, emergent issues, but patients. But 34% of 477 denials were reversed in favor of patients. Only 34% were decided in favor of patients. Expedited reviews, a little bit more, 42%. Is that the right number? Are these judgment calls being made the right way? Is there a better way to do it? Do some organizations do it in ways that are more, defensible than others? It would be interesting to do that research. It would be interesting and important to figure out, who's overseeing these reviews and how well are they doing it. We talked about quality research, right? So to what extent does patient advocacy contribute to quality of care, right? There's no research on that. There really isn't research on that. And maybe the ABIM Trust Project has done something, and and we're missing it. But either, we may have missed it, but that is a lesson in itself, that it's not being very well shared and promoted. And it's not only empirical research that's needed; it's conceptual research. What's the other elephant in the room? Determinations of medical necessity can't just be made based on medical science. They also have to consider cost, right? And what is the role of cost considerations in what is medically necessary or not? Cost effectiveness, cost benefit. That case from Nebraska, Flowland, $100,000 a year, is it worth it to keep somebody alive? Is $100,000 too much to pay? What if the only thing that drug did was extend life by a month or a week? Is it medically necessary or not? How do we make those judgments, right? At this point, to me, that this is a black box, right? I mean, so to what extent are external reviewers taking cost into consideration? There is no mention of it in the regulations that create these external review organizations. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, question?
Before you go on to the next slide, thank you.
Microphone for quick microphone.
Professor, I've never seen this slide obviously before, but I mean, the question that has to be asked when you come under that internal review is does that imply that 99.9% of the initial pre-authorization requests were just abandoned?
Yeah, that's what
they were abandoned.
Right.
99.9%
of the are not appealed internally.
Were abandoned.
So let's see. I think I can do the next slide. So this is a report by the AMA's Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs. I think it was from 2012, this is physician stewardship of healthcare resources. They issued a report. What is the obligation of physicians to be stewards of scarce healthcare resources? And this is what they said. They said physicians' primary ethical obligations to promote the well-being of individual patients. Physicians also have a long recognized obligation to patients in general to promote public health and access to care. This obligation requires physicians to be prudent stewards of the shared societal resources with which they are entrusted. Managing healthcare resources responsibly is compatible with their primary obligation to serve the interests of individual patients, suggesting that physicians, when they think about what is medically necessary, should take into account the issue of cost, the issue of scarcity of resources, and so on. And that's, and so if you think about one of the ways that we have devised to control healthcare spending is what we call rationing at the bedside, right? The physician who says, it's just not worth it to order $100,000 a year drug for this patient for whatever the reason, which often, by the way, is discrimination, right? Racial discrimination. We've seen, there are studies that show that. So this is suggesting that that's appropriate, right? That, you don't want to spend too much on people. Go back to Daniel Callahan's recommendation that once you're 82, Medicare should stop, paying for life-sustaining care for you. But if you read to the end of the report, this is how they propose to operationalize that stewardship responsibility. Choose the course of action that requires fewer resources when alternative courses of action offer similar likelihood and degree of anticipated benefit compared to anticipated harm for the individual patient, but require different levels of resources. In other words, if there are two drugs that are equally effective and one is cheaper, prescribe the cheaper one. Safe and effective, prescribe the cheaper one. Duh. But that, of course, doesn't really respond to the question of how do we take cost into consideration. Dr. Battanti, you still have the...
I have a serious issue with this. This says that if you have two drugs and one is cheaper and it gives the same result, then that's the one you should use. I have not seen anything in here that says you're going to tell the patient and get his informed consent for this very issue. And I'm going to tell you, I got two drugs. They both work the same. One is cheaper, but it has more side effects.
No, yeah, but what this has to assume is that the risk-benefit ratios are identical.
Okay.
Which may be very difficult to prove, but absolutely, if there's different risk profiles, then it's not equivalent.
But I want to see informed consent in any scheme like this.
Okay, good point. So, but this is, I think, an elephant in our room. When we talk about the physician's duty to advocate and to, to ensure medically necessary care, to what extent is that simply a question of, of medicine in the sense of risk, risks and benefits? And to what extent should that, or must that consider, or must someone consider, yeah, but is it cost effective, right? And so we know that there are other ways of bringing cost into the equation. We know that the British National Health Service has an agency that calculates cost effectiveness and makes decisions about what they will and will not pay for in the National Health Service. So here's the committee. This is eculizumab for I can't pronounce it. Here's a drug. The committee considered that it had not been presented with enough justification for the high cost per patient of the drug, right? And so, but we don't have a federal agency like that in this country, although little known, the state of Washington has one. For its workers' compensation programs and its state Medicaid program, the state of Washington has a technology assessment program that does cost effectiveness determinations and will not pay for example, peripheral nerve ablation for limb pain. It won't pay for it because it's determined that it is not a covered benefit based on a cost benefit analysis, not simply a safety and efficacy analysis. So my long way of saying, we need research for some of our proposals. We need to make them more concrete. We need to back them up with data. We need to fill in some blanks. So ideally, if we were going to go forward, we would want to have some kind of a research program that, a program that could fund investigators, whether it be empirical or conceptual, to continue to explore these areas. I'm thinking of, you may have heard of the Greenwald Foundation, which funds bioethical studies. But I'm thinking of something, it's not wouldn't be a foundation, and it would be narrowly focused on the theme of fidelity to patients, right? So far as I know, and the APIM program that Fred mentioned may be one, but which I again haven't heard of. But if there isn't one that can be called upon to do this, then I think one needs to be created and funded by foundations, if possible, not just one, but maybe a consortium of foundations, perhaps eventually becoming endowed to continue its work. There could be government grants, although they're a pain in the neck to get, like from AHRQ. I mean, so you can get funding for a demonstration grant from HHS that way. Might be another way of doing it. So that's one thing that would be a good way, I think, a necessary way of carrying this forward. Now, the researchers and people who are working in this area need to be able to communicate with one another, right? They need to be able to share their work. They need to be able to create consensus documents, for example, resolutions and things like that they then propose and disseminate. So, we need to not hold this. This shouldn't be just the one conference, that's been held on this, that's being held on this. We need periodic conferences. We need to be able to do workshops, bring people together who are going to, pursue pieces of this. Maybe a peer exchange capability, like a website or a blog, where people can talk in real time about these things and what they're doing and what they hope should happen. A possibility beyond that would be a peer-reviewed journal that could publish work in this area. There is no journal now that is dedicated to publishing research, publishing conceptual pieces on the importance of fidelity to patients. And so another idea is perhaps we need a new journal. And one possibility is a model for that is a journal that Dr. Letterman created. It's an online journal called Pathogens and Immunity. And if you would take a moment to tell us what is unique about that journal that we might copy if we could.
Well, everything is unique. I mean, there's some aspects of this journal that could be useful for this particular application, but there's some that are that are not. But the reason this journal was generated was because of fundamental frustration among academic researchers with the for-profit biomedical research enterprise, which we felt was taking advantage of scientists and researchers. It wasn't the issue of peer review, which is central to the quality of any kind of communication, but it was mostly the logistics of getting one's work evaluated, submitted, and ultimately published, where despite the fact that there were substantial costs to either read many articles in journals and to submit and have published one's articles, most of the work has been sort of placed on the shoulders of researchers. So we got irritated about it and decided we could do it a little differently. The key, of course, was getting funding, and we got funds from a charitable foundation, and put together a journal that puts the needs of researchers first. Everything about the journal is designed to make life easier. Submission takes fewer than 5 minutes. We review articles in any format. As you know, if you've had an article rejected by a journal and you want to send it somewhere else, you often need to reformat it before they'll even take a look at it. Well, we dispensed with that and decided that we'd review in any format and only request modification to our own format if the piece was accepted. We review our reviewers. Each of the senior editors evaluates the quality of the reviews, and we let our reviewers know that we're satisfied or not with their work. We pay our reviewers. Each of our reviewers gets a modest honorarium for getting a review back to us in a timely way. That's fewer than 10 days. The journal itself is free open access, and there are no charges to authors. And when we launched, John Cohen in Science magazine gave us rave reviews. So we've been up for 6 years now, and we have served as a model for a number of other scientific publications who've taken on some of our policies. We'd be glad to share them with you. Our website is easily usable, and our papers are cited on average. Our impact factor that we calculated ourselves is 3 or better, 3.0 or 3.4, depending upon the year. And we have another, well, it's a good journal, and we'd be glad to share what we do with you. We live off an endowment. So the proceeds of the endowment provide us our annual costs and expenses, which are fairly modest. It's not as expensive as you think to run a journal that's entirely online and has no paper costs.
So think about, one thought is, a vehicle for public publishing, for peer reviewing and publishing work in this area, focused on this area, just like your journal is focused on infectious disease and so forth. Lots of other suggestions, organizing, outreach, public relations, reaching out to organizations like AMSA, like AMC and so forth, trying to get, this added to medical school curricula. This takes effort, right? So there needs to be a administrative, an infrastructure to carry on. There needs to be, a coordinator. There needs to be, some sort of assistance, staff and so forth. And most importantly, for our discussion, there need to be a group of facilitators and supporters. And what I'm hoping, if you think this is worth pursuing, any or all of these pieces, and trying to keep this effort going, is that you will all agree to the extent that you can, to be, continue to provide advice and support, and to pass it on to others that people that you're connected with. I mean, I want to reach out to Mark Jason, for example, and others that I know to see if they would be interested in participating, maybe on an advisory board or something. Any thoughts on any of that? I mean, it's very ambitious, but I think it's critical. I mean, like I said at the very beginning, most people, I think it's fair to say, think it's too late. The horse has left the barn. the practice of medicine is what it is, and it's not going to be able to become what this sort of vision is. I hope that's not the case, but if it's not the case, then something has to be done about it. And we need a mechanism, we need a way of getting that done. Dr. Letterman.
So Max, this has been really interesting for me. These sessions, this is somewhat out of my area of expertise, but I'm impressed that you're in your list of things to do today, you're trying to tackle everything, and it's going to be really difficult to do that with any level of effectiveness and or even precision. But it seems as though the bulk of your focus, or the bulk of your focus, strange way but your focus seems to be primarily on advocating for service, for coverage, for care, for specific things like ensure denial of care, and the need for the healthcare system to do better with that. And maybe that's where you should put the bulk of your energies. There are lots of things you can do. You can worry about tuition, you can worry about so many things, but that seems to be where you have both interest and expertise, and that might be the area to focus on mostly.
Yeah, one of the things I did not propose to do today was to create priorities. I didn't want to diminish the value of any of our ideas yet. Because part of whether they are, achievable depends on, in many cases, knowing more about what it would take to achieve them and how that could be done, and then decide this is just, out of range. This is practical and possible. This is, in my grandkids' lifetime and so forth. So I was going to hold off on that, but my question is is a very sort of limited one now, and that is, we don't have a lot of people here, but for those who are, do you think it's worth pursuing? Trying to create some kind of ongoing effort, if so, something that you would be willing to, be, to the extent you can, obviously, help facilitate, participate. And I don't need an answer now, but I'd like you to think about it, and most importantly, not most importantly, but in addition, think about who else we can reach out to try to get the resources, to be able to carry out whatever the highest priority initiatives are. And I have a name for this. I call it the Fidelity Project. I'm hopeful that this doesn't stop here. What do you think? Any thoughts? Well, let me turn it around. Anybody see any sort of fundamental reasons why we shouldn't try to keep going? I don't see any hands. Hear any? Dr. Patandi.
I think it has to keep going, because if you don't at least make an attempt at it, I think it's going to be a quick capitulation from here till nobody has an advocate for themselves. It's just the way it's going. You can see the trajectory. Doctors don't even know they have a fidelity to patients. I mean, that's a bad start right there. And then how to do it, of course, is the second question, and how far to take it beyond that. But I think it is important. And I want to say thank you for, putting it together and and raising awareness to it, because this is the first step to doing it.
Yes, Dr. Frizzle.
We talked about history from the beginning. Your initial talk was about, the history going back to 1847. And I think we have to look, there's no promised trajectory, but there are anticipated trajectories of where healthcare is going to go. I have a relatively new friend who is one of the leaders of the Physician Executive MBA program in Knoxville, Tennessee. And when he and I talk about, where healthcare is going and how to make the kind of major transformational changes that fascinate me, his comment is that the future is in value-based payment as opposed to the current system that we have that messes us up. And we started talking at the beginning about the pre-authorization and all the problems from it. And his point, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but I think this is sort of relevant to where the future is going, is that in the future, it's not going to be a private agency or a private for-profit company that says you can or cannot do this, but that function, which is currently the authorization function, which is currently in a separate for-profit entity, is in fact going to be within health systems. And his metaphor is, instead of calling some stranger and getting a nurse practitioner like my wife to say whether or not something is needed, it's going to be your colleague in your institution. And that's going to be a big change. So whether or not his theory of the future is correct, I do think that as we look at a multi-year project, it really needs to be integrated with where is healthcare going. And that's one suggestion. Whether or not that's an accurate prediction, I don't know, but I certainly had not thought of it until we talked about it a few months ago.
And we're sort of, we've kind of touched on that with talking about the role of medical staffs in this realm. We've talked about the how to do medical necessity determinations and should it be external, should it be internal? So very good point. Other thoughts, comments? I mean, so I would propose to try to move this forward. I think I'm not hearing any strong objections. And so I'd like to be able to continue to remain in touch with you. I think one of the things I would ask you to think about is sources of funding to keep this going. And I think it's foundations, so it could be, private sources, but I think, I'm thinking of a startup. I don't think of an endowment because you can only use so little of that. I'm thinking of, say a startup grant, maybe a demonstration grant of our own of, for maybe 5 years or less than that, that would fund, the creation of, this project and, the first steps that it can take to move forward. And whether we have a journal, whether we can fund a research program, whether it makes sense to try to operate our own research funding program where you need, reviewers and evaluations of proposals, or whether we can piggyback with, say, ABIM or some other foundation that has the infrastructure already to do that, is a question that we ought to think about. And that's where I'd like to go. Professor Van Tassel.
So just an idea as I was trying to pull everything together that I've heard, a way also to have funding and a way to have some grassroots efforts happen alongside the bigger efforts that you're talking about. We have, a huge growth in medical legal partnerships across the country. And as I'm listening to the physicians about their ability to have the time to advocate, and particularly they're not getting paid to do this work, I think that maybe a partnership with tapping into the medical legal partnerships we have now, growing more, where what we're doing is we're teaching our law students how to handle these cases. So that's what I do in my, when I talk about Medicare and Medicaid, you talk about some of the nitty gritty here. Having them partner up with medical students is, to be the experts who will, write the supporting documents as you're doing the appeals. So that we've got a partnership between the medical school and the law students and our hospitals and our physicians. Then there's teaching that would be involved, so that this would be a way to teach the medical students about that fiduciary duty. The law students could be involved in that teaching. So that's kind of picks up on Dr. B. The hospitals probably would be, I would think they'd be interested, and my understanding is that they're very interested in this because it increases coverage, right? So that's the bottom line. It increases the ability to pay for these things. And so it's sort of a, while you're working on this in a big picture scheme, this is just a grassroots way to get things started and to talk about this in a different, rebrand it. I like the Dr. C's branding, keep it simple. So that it could start and accomplish multiple things at the same time. There was also, so that was my initial thought, was that there's funding out there for these medical legal partnerships. There is a lot of funding out there for it, and a lot of private funding out there for it. So that's just my bottom line practical contribution to the conversation. So thank you.
As you were speaking about that, it occurred to me, talking about getting advice from law students. There were two proposals that were floated briefly yesterday by, I think, me, that we didn't re-mention today, and that is the idea of some kind of source of advice to practitioners on how to deal with issues like this. I mean, the WIC line doctor who wants to know, what to do when the extended stay is denied this, she has to pay the extra, money herself and things. So I'm thinking of possibly some kind of advisory capability to advise physicians, and possibly even something like a Fidelity hotline, where you could, call up and say, what do I do now? And have, interested experts who would be willing to sort of, give their 2 cents advice. And maybe, if the physician follows that advice, that could be used as if there's a problem that results and there's potential trouble for the physician can offer as, in her defense, by the way, I got my, advice from this source and I followed it, and this is a reputable, here's who they are, and they're credited by such and such. Anyway, just a thought.
So one of the things that I think about is I think about all of our resources out there as our folks retire, and as our law students move into the community. So you have people who are working these clinics, right? And access to healthcare clinic, and they also because once you've learned it, it's fairly accessible and it's fairly easy to do. The ability to do volunteer hours to keep coming back to the clinic to staff that kind of a helpline would be there. In addition, our law students and our medical students can train a very vast group of individuals who are smart, who want to be involved, who could contribute to this, maybe through our community centers, right? Holding workshops, et cetera, to educate our elders on how to do these appeals. It's shocking, right? The few number of appeals that are out there, and the statistics that I've seen are matched up. Particularly right now, I'm very interested in home healthcare and allowing our elders to stay in their home to age in place. 70%, if you do bother to appeal, 70% success rate if you appeal. So just harnessing all of that energy would be pretty exciting.
Maybe just one comment on her comment was to be able to help people doing the appeals, that they don't even know, medical students don't even know the concept of medical necessity. So, I mean, you got to go way back, to give them some fundamental language and some fundamental concepts. And here at Case, you got one of the great law medicine programs, and you're not talking to the medical students here in Cleveland. Now, I'm not saying that this is, an outlier. I don't think it's being done anywhere. So, I mean, that's a big problem. You got a great resource here, and it's underutilized. I mean, you did have some medical students here, but
Can't get access to them.
Can't get access.
I mean, there used to be, this is when I talked about medical school curricular changes. Our medical school used to have a type A elective requirement. And one of the ways they could, they had to fulfill this, and one of the ways they could do it was to take certain courses at the law school, including this course on healthcare controversies that I mentioned. But then they switched their curriculum in the early 2000s. So students still, we have a health advocacy organization in the medical school because there are tracks, and there's a health advocacy track. And there are professors. Vanessa Nair is one of the advisors to that track, and they can declare that as an interest of theirs. And if they complete certain requirements, they can show that they completed this health advocacy requirement. And one of the requirements is to take my healthcare controversies course. So that's why I have 25 medical students in it. You're right. I mean, there's that we've got to figure out ways to reach medical students as well. So I guess what I'm saying is I think we're out of time, but but I want to I hear that it's worth continuing. We will be producing a report of this conference, but I also would like to, if I may, continue to consult you and again, I think we need a larger group. There are other people who wanted to be here but couldn't. For example, Libby Rosenthal from Kaiser Health Fund, Kaiser Family Foundation, Kaiser News was supposed to be here but had health issues and so forth. So there are other people that I would like to reach out to on behalf of this project. But I'd like to hope that you will all continue to be at least some people I can email ideas to, and again, with due respect to all the other commitments that you have, not impose on you, but avail myself of your wisdom. Is that feasible? All right. Last thoughts? If not, just tremendous thanks to all of the people who made this possible, our speakers, our expert audience members, our administrative staff, Patty Harbold, Rob Combe, Rebecca Smith, our facilitator and colleague, Catherine Van Tassel, Laura McNally Levine, and the Cooperative of American Physicians who helped fund this and make this possible financially. I hope I didn't leave anybody out. It wasn't on purpose. And in the meantime, stay tuned. Onward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you so much for participating. Couldn't have done it without you.
Something beyond Youngstown. We're gonna do this.
I'm just a girl, you can't say it else.
Just saying, I got 2 classes this afternoon. I can stay awake to do it.
Like it or not.
Whatever. Good to meet you. It's a pleasure. That's it. Is there
That was the idea.
Yes.
An alternative, the alternative is to take advantage of existing. No, but I mean for research. Yeah. So instead of having a research ourselves, just encourage.
So,
Right.
if you coordinate it, then you.
Well, yeah, I talked about, I want to run into one of Max's articles. Started studying those.
Sure. But just tell them you can go here. Somebody's lucky, right, proposal, somebody's got a.
Yeah.
And if you've got it.
How long have you been?
So I actually.
Robert, are we still live?
Yes.
Okay, just very important. There is a slide up if you're
Max,
still.
hold on, let me turn the audio back up.
Huh? Oh.
All right, go ahead. Max.
Okay, yeah, if you're still with us and you want CLE credit, here's information about how to get that. And if there's any issue with that, please contact Patty Harbold. You see her email address, but you have a way of seeking CLE credit, and you have an activity code that you need to enter into your information. Thank you.
But we just started.
And you're, you know, and you're a smart guy, so. Giving us a lot of advice. Yeah, that's very.
Litigation. They want to be
That's the truth. That's the truth.
And I'm gonna LinkedIn.
I'm not, but you probably. Myself.
That's the reason I asked. I don't know when.
Yes, yeah.
Pleasure.
Nice to see you. Yes, definitely. Have a good weekend.
Trust me, I got my shot.
Okay. Good.
See you later.
Bye.
Oh, yes, Daniel.
So I would hope that I met Max through Alvin, who was a collaborator of mine. He was inspiration for me.
Really originally.
So Alvin was like Amsterdam downtown, and they had an incredible view of the lake. And so once a year, when two angels came to the air show. Already at their place.
Oh my God.
And so that was, so we.
Right.
Now,
Demonstration. Demonstration.
creative medical
Advocacy.
advocacy
Right.
project.
So if you're going to do research, and then your goal, when you start research, here are the questions you need to, here's what we need to know. And when strategy of fixing, we get this, controlled way using the expertise of clinical researchers. Experienced clinical researchers. I've read for years, some other people who know how to do this.
Yeah, and I'm retired, so
The projects will be done here at our institutions.
I left first in healthcare. And so, but
JB here.
consistent with the comments I made, I think that issues besides the small things we can do, it's a culture shift.
So,
That's what's needed to move us in the right direction. And so that's, I've gotten much more interested in patient strategy. And that's where
it's not too far
you know,
away.
comes from.
My wife told me that she's chatting.
Instead of being tied up with her military role.
So
Was she here the other day?
the venomous arrow spoke.
Yeah, that's great, that's great.
But her dad's family